autobiography, you argue that the pension credit was based on the same principle of progressive universalism that had underpinned your reform of the welfare state. And I want to just ask you how you came to develop this kind of framework of ideas for welfare, both before becoming Chancellor and then in your first term in particular as Chancellor.
I think we were looking at how you could build from a universal benefit. So child benefit and pensions were effectively universal benefits. One was of course contributory and one was non-contributory, but they were both universal, available depending on your age as a benefit to every child, and in this case every pensioner. But we knew that we could not solve the problem of pensioner poverty simply by raising the basic pension, that would spread the resources you have in such a way that you would never have enough to take people who were really very badly affected, who had either no occupational pension or who had a limited state pension or who had no other savings in the world. So we determined that we had to do something about the poorest pensioners. We had to do something particularly about widows who were in their 70s and 80s. We had to do something quickly as well, because these were people that were growing old and had been left cruelly to a life on what were very unsatisfactory means-tested benefits, many of which they didn't know how to claim or didn't claim. So we wanted to target help through the pension credit to that group of pensioners who were in poverty, and to my satisfaction in a way, we managed to reduce pensioner poverty from something in the order of 35% to around 10, 11 or 12%, and maybe we could have done more if we'd stayed in power, because we were very well aware that more had to be done. And I think that is the right balance, that you have a universal benefit, but you build on it by targeting support to those most in need. It is the same principle that governs child tax credit, but it applies differently in the case of the pension credit. We had to deal with a situation where there were obviously people who were debarred from getting the credit because of savings, and all these difficult decisions had to be made about what the limits were. But generally speaking, we took, I think, 2 million pensioners out of poverty, and I think that was something that I really had wanted to do for some time.
So at around the same time, there was sort of build-up of also problems in the private pensions systems, in the occupational pensions. Can you say a little bit more about that? So you were reducing pensioner poverty through the basic state pension and the pension credit, but at the same time there was a lot happening in defined benefit schemes going bust. Can you say something about what motivated you reform in that area?
Well, we had a huge debate about this, because the Conservatives were alleging at the time that we had introduced a dividend tax credit that was penalising corporations, and was one reason why defined pensions were being got rid of. But I think the evidence we were able to bring forward said that that was not a cause. I think we were able to show that the pensions resources were rising, and I think that there was a lot of propaganda about this at the time that was completely unfair, and so I hold to the reforms we made. Of course, when you look at occupational pensions, this shift has been something that is, not desirable. It's something that you didn't want to happen. But you understand that right around the world, these were the pressures that people were under in occupational pension schemes. But I don't think the change that was happening could be attributed to government policy.
Can I just talk to you a bit about reform within the Labour Party? Because obviously at that time there were figures like Barbara Castle, Jack Jones, Rodney Bickerstaff. How sort of influential were they in debating with you issues that then became important for the Labour government?
Well, I used to say Barbara Castle was my mentor, but she was also my tormentor, because she and Jack Jones were insistent that the only way of dealing with the pension problem was to raise the basic state pension. And I had done a column for Jack Jones's Union Record, the newspaper, over really 20 years, almost, putting the case for pensioners. But I'd always explained that we had to get the balance right between universal and targeted benefits. Barbara actually was probably more adamant that we had to retain only the universal side of it and against means-tested benefits. Jack, I found, understood what we were trying to do, although that was not the official policy. Barbara promised me that if I came to her birthday party, I remember, and spoke at her birthday party when she was celebrating it, that she wouldn't come to the conference and attack my pensions policy. But of course I went to speak at her birthday party and she came to the conference and attacked my pensions policy. And I said this at her funeral, but with a great deal of affection, because I understood that she was taking this view as someone who had been responsible for the growth of occupational pensions in the first place. She was right to focus on the rights that pensioners should have. But there's no doubt in my mind that we could not have got 2 million pensioners out of poverty had we not had the targeted benefit, the pension credit. And I think it is true that the Conservatives have not managed to get rid of it, despite the fact that many might have wanted to do so. But when we changed the nature of the pension system after 2006-07, of course we were able to return to an earnings-related pension.
So on that point then, so you'd reduced pensioner poverty very successfully through the pension credit, but you were now moving to a sort of longer term change in policy, which when you were Prime Minister, the legislation came through Parliament in 2007-2008, and the earnings link was put back in. Now, most people would argue that was only possible because there was a consensus that the state pension age would go up. That would in turn help pay for the restoration of the earnings link, and then people would also be auto-enrolled into private schemes. Is that your sense of how that consensus was achieved? Because there were differences between the Treasury and others about that question, weren't there?
Well, look, after 1997 we looked at a whole range of options for the future, and the papers will reveal that lots of things were just discussed but never seriously pushed forward. We were not in a position, we thought, for some time to relink pensions to earnings simply because of the cost of doing that. But obviously we wanted to do it if it was at all possible. What made it possible was an understanding that as the pension age changed and we had made the pension credit work, and actually because earnings and inflation were not rising in the same way that they did in the past, that it was possible to afford this. But it was, as you rightly say, part of a long-term settlement, and it was a long-term settlement that was based on what would happen to the pension age, particularly of course the age for women. And that was a difficult set of policy decisions to agree. I think the fact that eventually there was an all-party consensus on that was helpful. We didn't manage to achieve that in some other areas like the National Health Service, and so to achieve it on pensions was better. I think the preparatory work that was done by having an investigation led by Adair Turner was important to this. I think the fact that he had been head of the CBI and therefore the business organisation in Britain made it easier for him to sell his proposal to employers and to the Conservative Party. So I think we managed to get a consensus that was hard fought, but took some time to materialise.
The main explanation then for why these reforms, auto-enrolment, the creation of NEST, this increase in the state pension, that's all stayed in place really since the financial crisis, when so much else in our welfare state has, particularly for working age people, has been cut. I mean, how do you begin to explain that? Is it because there was a political consensus, or is it because some of these benefits are much harder to cut?
You've got to remember that our consensus on pensions was based not simply on the state pension being a universal benefit for people of a certain age, and the means-tested element of it, including the pension credit. We had free television licenses for the over 75s. We had free travel, in buses and so on. Where there were a number of benefits that we made universal to win support for a proper balance between the universal and the selective. And I think it was important to build a consensus by showing that there were in certain areas we would have universal benefits. We would not simply have everything means tested, but if we wanted to get to the heart of pensioner poverty, we had to do something different, like the pension credit. How has it survived? Well, to some extent it's starting to fray. The universal television license has become an issue. I think other services are under pressure. There is the whole question of social care, and that's a huge issue that affects both pensions and expenditure on the health and social services. So a consensus, as I've found, may last for 10 years, may last for a bit longer, and it has lasted longer on pensions, but it is not inevitable that consensus is going to survive forever.